It's been seen as one of the greatest love stories of the 20th century. The king who gave up his crown for the woman he loved.
That I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love.
To the world, the story went that it was impossible for Edward VIII, as head of the Church of England, to marry Wallis Simpson, an American who had been twice divorced. Declassified FBI files show that the abdication crisis was more about naked political intrigue than affairs of the heart.
I've seen the FBI files for the Windsors, and some of those reports are really damning.
That whilst Edward was courting Wallis Simpson, she was having affairs with other men, including a prominent Nazi official. That Edward was a Nazi sympathizer who wanted to keep Britain out of the war at almost any cost. That Winston Churchill saw the couple as such a threat, he forced them into virtual exile. That during the war, Hitler saw Edward as having a future role in a Nazi-controlled Britain.
Hitler would have made him a sort of puppet king. God knows what would have happened after that.
These alarming files reveal to what extent the British and American government saw this couple as a major threat to national security. And they reveal the extraordinary lengths they went to keep them out of harm's way. Britain has been waging war against Nazi Germany for a year and a half. Winston Churchill is desperate for the United States to join the Allies. President Roosevelt is sympathetic, but he knows the American people need a lot of persuading. They both fear that their plans for an alliance could be jeopardized by the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. They're outspoken, pro-German, and about to set foot in Miami. Roosevelt instructs the FBI to spy on the most famous couple in the world.
Roosevelt knows that they're dangerous, and he has the FBI follow them about and intercept their mail, and there's a very large security operation.
To the public, they couldn't be more glamorous. To the authorities, they couldn't be more dangerous.
He'd always admired Hitler. He was, frankly, very pro-Nazi.
In America, there is a powerful lobby against joining the war. Churchill can ill afford any negative publicity from the Windsors. So on their arrival in Miami, a PR man is assigned to muzzle any remarks they might make.
The Duchess and I are naturally very glad to set foot in America again.
So every move they make is monitored. Even their dry cleaning is inspected. Now, FBI files running to 227 pages have been released under the Freedom of Information Act.
For some time, the British government has known that the Duchess of Windsor was exceedingly pro-German in her sympathies and connections. And there is strong reason to believe that this is the reason why she was considered so obnoxious to the British government. They refused to permit Edward to marry her and maintain the throne.
The FBI were fed their information on the Windsors from British intelligence, who in 1935 had taken the unprecedented step of following the couple. The Duke was then the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne. Special Branch knew that his lover, Wallis Simpson, was not only married and once divorced, but they also believed she was promiscuous. Their files record,
"She was regarded as a person very fond of the company of men, and to have had many affairs. She was with different men at these addresses."
The British Secret Service were watching the Windsors pretty closely and reporting on their every movement.
Detectives discovered that one of the men Wallis Simpson was seeing as well as the Prince was a 36-year-old car salesman called Guy Trundle. Through their surveillance, they uncovered the fact that Wallis was introducing the heir to the throne to a range of unsavory characters. Among them, the scandalous socialite Lady Emerald Cunard, Their report describes her as
a drug addict, a mother of notorious Nancy Cunard, who is very partial to coloured men and who scandalised society by living in a Negro district of New York.
Through Lady Cunard, Prince Edward was introduced to Sir Oswald Mosley, leader of the British Union of Fascists who were causing riots across London.
Edward inquired as to how many supporters Mosley had for his British Union of Fascists.
But there were far more dangerous fascists who were only too eager to meet the prince and especially his new lover. Through Lady Cunard, Edward and Wallace were introduced to an ambitious German diplomat called Joachim von Ribbentrop. Hitler had appointed Ribbentrop to be Germany's special envoy to Great Britain, with the task of building a strong alliance between the two countries. And according to the FBI files, it wasn't long before von Ribbentrop and Wallace started an affair. This is confirmed in an interview given to the FBI by a close German relative of Edward's, Duke Karl Alexander of Württemberg, who had become a priest.
He knew definitely that von Ribbentrop, while in England, sent the then Wallace Simpson 17 carnations every day. The 17 supposedly represented the number of times they'd slept together.
There were widespread rumors that they were romantically involved, and I don't think it's possible to prove that was the case, but that was certainly the buzz in these circles.
What is clear from the FBI files is that Wallace would stay in contact with Ribbentrop for many years to come, and this would prove invaluable to Hitler, who would now set about forging a link with Prince Edward, the heir to the British throne.
Hitler was trying to develop a relationship with Edward with the goal of ultimately manipulating him, using him to form this Anglo-German alliance.
Wallace's continuing relationship with Ribbentrop would prove to be dangerous. Ribbentrop would rise quickly through the ranks, becoming Hitler's foreign minister. Prince Edward's affair with Wallace Simpson would lead him to sacrifice his crown and be ostracized from the royal family. These newly released FBI files show how close he would come to betraying his country. Long before he fell under Wallace Simpson's spell, Edward, Prince of Wales, was the most eligible bachelor in the world. A fearless horseman, athlete and pilot, he gave a sheen to the monarchy not seen before, entrancing the British public.
He wore these sort of rather ridiculous clothes, and he winked awfully well, and he grinned slyly out of the side of his mouth, and everybody rather loved it, you know.
He was good-looking and boyish and approachable and charming, and the crowds loved him.
He was at the forefront of fashion, popularising his very own Windsor knot.
He was a handsome playboy with a lot of charm, and a wonderful contrast to his father, King George V, who never cracked a smile at all, ever, and never told, as far as I know, a joke. If he did, I bet it was a very bad one.
Prince Edward was born on the 23rd of June 1894. His upbringing was harsh and disciplined, with spells in both the Royal Navy and the Grenadier Guards.
I think he got it into his head that he was a wonder boy, really, and that the duties were something that were put upon him.
Unlike his father, George V, Prince Edward liked to travel. One of his earliest trips was to Germany in 1913, where there were close family ties.
The family saw themselves as German. They were very comfortable speaking German at home, and Edward on several occasions referred to German as his mother language, as his Muttersprache.
But in 1917, Edward's father, George V, changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor.
This was an attempt to make the family appear more English, and of course they fabricated the name of Windsor. They took it from one of their castles, and it's purely invented.
Prince Edward made 16 tours to the far-flung corners of the globe. He became the face of the British Crown abroad, and it made him enormously popular.
Let me emphasize his overpowering capacity, when he chose to use it, to make people practically fall down in his path and kiss his feet. The effect was remarkable.
His adventures abroad were captured on film, enthralling the British public, accustomed to the stuffy formality of a remote royal family.
He was mobbed. He was treated like Prince William today times 10. He was constantly having women fling themselves at him, and he was being cheered to the echo. And so as a result, of course, this is going to inflate his ego.
These images of Edward only told part of the story.
He could charm birds off trees, but it doesn't stop him behaving badly. There are records of his many trips to India where he behaved disgracefully and sort of walked out of public ceremonies and refused to meet the people he was required to meet.
He is said to have barely risen much before 11 o'clock, playing squash or golf by day and smoking and drinking by night in the Embassy Club.
He was inclined to tipple a bit, and when he tippled, he was inclined to show off a bit.
Sir Alan Lascelles, his assistant private secretary, later wrote,
I camped and tramped with him across Central Africa, but by 1927 my idol had feet of clay. When we got news from Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin of his father's grave illness, the Prince said, I don't believe a word of it. It doesn't mean a thing. He went without a word and spent the remainder of the evening in the successful seduction of a Mrs. Barnes, wife of the local commissioner. He told me so the next morning.
Stories of Edward's behaviour abroad reached the ears of the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, who began to question the Prince's suitability to be king. Alan Lascelles' diary recalls a candid meeting he had with Baldwin.
You know, sometimes when I sit waiting to hear about some point-to-point in which the Duke is riding, I can't help thinking that the best thing that could happen to him, and the country, would be for him to break his neck. God forgive me, replied Baldwin. So do I.
The adoring British public knew nothing of Edward's many affairs, especially with married women.
I think he preferred the married ones. It was kind of safer and they knew what they were about and they wouldn't make trouble for him.
His first known affair was in 1915 with Marion Coke, 12 years his senior. In 1918, Frida Dudley Ward.
One of his mistresses, called Mrs. Dudley Ward, sought to improve his mind a little bit by lending him the novel Jane Eyre. And some time went by, and then he brought it back to her, handed it back to her, and said, I can't get on with this at all. Can't get on. Who are these Bront people, anyway? Which showed the depth of his ignorance and lack of culture.
Edward dated Mildred Harris, formerly the wife of Charlie Chaplin, and in 1930, Lady Thelma Furness, who would introduce him to her friend, Wallis Simpson.
Poor Thelma Furness was really betrayed by Wallis. When Thelma Furness went abroad, she asked Wallis to look after the little man. And when she came back, she found how well Wallis had looked after the little man.
Wallis Simpson was born Bessie Wallace Warfield in Pennsylvania in 1896.
You could say she was a gold digger. I mean, she was one of those women who can only see their way through marriages through rich men.
Twice married, Wallis is believed to have once had an affair with Count Galeazzo Ciano, later to become Mussolini's son-in-law. It's believed she became pregnant by him and had an abortion which left her unable to conceive. Wallis became Edward's mistress while she was still married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson. The king despaired. He had a list drawn up of the 17 most eligible European princesses for his son. But Edward was not to be swayed from his devotion to Wallis. He showered Wallis with lavish gifts.
She did give the impression of being terrifically tough. Funny, quick, amusing, wonderful sense of humor. She was always said to have said, at the height of the abdication crisis, darling, you must understand, you can't abdicate and eat it. A very good line.
One account describes how Wallis would make Edward beg like a dog for cigarettes. It appeared to everyone that he enjoyed being dominated by her. One of the FBI statements taken from Edward's relative, Father Odo, recalls how Wallis had told a public party that
the Duke is impotent, and although he'd tried sexual intercourse with numerous women, they'd been unsuccessful in satisfying his passions. The Duchess had been the only woman able to satisfactorily gratify the Duke's sexual desires.
In 1935, the intimacy of an American divorcee to the heir to the throne drew the attention of Special Branch. But they weren't the only party who could see the power Wallis Simpson wielded over the prince. Hitler too could see an opportunity to get close to Edward by using his envoy von Ribbentrop to cultivate his relationship with Wallis.
When he saw the heir to the throne as someone who could potentially be manipulated, Hitler really devoted a great deal of interest and energy in this regard.
Hitler had long seen the impressionable heir to the throne as a useful ally, and now this relationship would become highly valuable to Germany. On January the 20th, 1936, King George V died. The Prince of Wales now became King Edward VIII. On the day of his ascension, the German ambassador, Leopold von Hirsch, wrote to Berlin.
He feels warm sympathy for Germany. I am convinced that his friendly attitude towards Germany might in time come to exercise a certain amount of influence on the shaping of British foreign policy.
It was crucial for Hitler to have King Edward's support. For years, Hitler had gained huge popularity in Germany by promising to tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles, which ceded the control of the Rhineland to the French. He was now ready to take the biggest gamble of his career and reclaim it for Germany. Edward was adamant that Britain would avoid any conflict. Ignoring the government, he began talking directly to the German ambassador.
He would hold political conversation with the German ambassador, which he never should have done.
Edward had stepped far beyond his role as king, which caused the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin to become increasingly alarmed.
Baldwin recognized Edward as being very dangerous and very disruptive. And remember, at this time, in March 1936, Edward is a tremendously popular king.
Edward even threatened Baldwin with his abdication should he decide to oppose Germany. He recounted this in one of his many calls to German Ambassador von Hirsch. He said, "I sent for the Prime Minister and gave him a piece of my mind. I told the old so-and-so that I would abdicate if he made war." Hirsch immediately informed Berlin.
The reassurances from King Edward VIII that Britain wasn't going to fight was crucial. Hitler had a kind of, you would say in American, with American poker, an ace in the hole, if you will, knowing what he did from Edward at this time.
On the 7th of March 1936, with the knowledge that the King of England would not oppose him, Hitler's troops goose-stepped across the border, reclaiming the Rhineland for Germany. England hadn't resisted, and without her, France and the rest of Europe stood back and watched.
It was a huge coup for Hitler. He sent troops in, and the rest of the world did nothing, even though it was a ripping up of the Versailles Treaty. And so really, we were then on the road, the Via Dolorosa, through to the disasters that took place in 1937 and, of course, 1938 and 39.
But as these threatening events unfolded, King Edward risked taking his lover, a divorcee, away on a potentially scandalous cruise around the Mediterranean. John Julius's parents went along too, taking their home movie camera with them and leaving us with this unique footage.
And my father sat next to Mrs. Simpson and knew all about what was going on. And he wrote in his diary, "I think she's probably a nice woman and she's an intelligent woman, but she's hard as nails and doesn't love him."
Jim Wallace, now Lord Dudley, was also on the cruise.
My father was a great friend of the king, as he then was. So I saw quite a lot of them on that trip. She wasn't, I thought, particularly pretty. Certainly to me, she didn't appear to be physically attractive. I thought she was a rather tiresome woman, and I couldn't quite see what the attraction was.
The British public were kept in ignorance of the trip because reporting on the personal lives of royalty was forbidden in England.
Magazines were censored. Photographs of Edward and Wallace were cut out of magazines before they were allowed into England. I mean, it was quite heavy.
While Europe and America were absorbed by the story of the king and the American divorcee, this news wouldn't break in England for another 2 months.
Photographs started to filter through of him with Mrs. Simpson, and there he was, with no top on, and her swimming, and all this.
When the media bombshell of the king's romance broke in England, it immediately raised the question of marriage.
In those days, divorce was if you'd been divorced once, you weren't allowed into the royal enclosure at Ascot. She'd been divorced twice.
As King of England, Edward was head of the church. For him to marry a woman who had already been twice married and with a living spouse meant he would have to abdicate.
The majority of the British public hated the idea of his abdicating, but they thought he shouldn't put this divorced, middle-aged American woman before his duty to his country. I think that's what they thought.
I think he was boxed into a bit of a corner by Baldwin and the government of the day, and I think he thought he was going to find a solution and then got himself into a corner in which he couldn't get out except by abdicating.
The abdication has always centered around King Edward's marriage, but these declassified FBI files show that his unacceptable relationship provided a convenient smokescreen for the government to remove him from the throne.
The British government were anxious to get rid of the Duke of Windsor, first and foremost because of his fondness for Nazi ideology.
The establishment wanted Edward gone.
Edward's pro-German views were important in terms of him being forced to abdicate towards the end of 1936.
And if Edward stood down, his younger brother Albert could take over.
Baldwin could clearly see the positive side to this crisis, and I think Baldwin thought Albert preferable to Edward. Undoubtedly, that was the case.
It was the first time in British history that the king had chosen to give up the crown.
I was deeply shocked that he should have given up a country and a great empire for this woman who I said didn't figure very highly in my estimation.
Wallis fled to France.
She left London because after the thing came out, people threw stones at her house and shouted, so she really fled.
On December the 10th, 1936, having reigned for under 1 year, Edward VIII signed the instrument of abdication.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. That I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love.
Edward's younger brother stepped onto the throne to become King George VI. Edward left the country. England had rid herself of a liability. But no one realized just how close they would come to having Edward back, as the FBI files reveal, this time with the backing of Hitler. Edward was no longer king, but he was now free to marry the woman he loved. Edward and Wallis were married at the Château de Condé in France on the 3rd of June 1937. The royal family boycotted the wedding. From now on, Edward's title was to be His Royal Highness the Duke of Windsor. Wallis was to be the Duchess of Windsor. George VI had seen to it that she couldn't use the title of Her Royal Highness. Now with the Windsors away on the continent, the Duke's outspoken views and careless talk would prove to be a major liability. At a party in Vienna in June 1937, a young American diplomat confided in him that the Americans had finally cracked Italy's intelligence codes. But just a few drinks later, and the Duke's loose tongue gave away this prized information to an Italian diplomat.
This was a real blunder. It was very problematic. The effect that the Americans are listening to you or have cracked your codes, and that had serious implications.
When US President Roosevelt was informed of this serious leak, it confirmed his long-held suspicions about the Duke. The Duke and Duchess were falling into dubious company. The chateau where they were married had been loaned to them by the Duke's close friend Charles Badeau, an industrialist who helped bankroll the Nazi Party.
Charles Badeau is still a very mysterious individual who evidently was a Nazi spy who was sending reports back to the Reich.
Badeau arranged for the Windsors to visit Germany in October 1937. Against Churchill's advice, they chose to sail there on the German ship, the Bremen.
British politicians were somewhere between apprehensive and horrified at the thought of Edward and Wallis going on this tour.
Berlin. A huge crowd greeted the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, and they were specially welcomed by Dr. Lai, the Reich's organization manager.
Hitler rolled out every red carpet that he could, gave them a tremendous slap-up time and buttered them up like nobody's business.
Later in the day, the Duke attended a workers' concert.
He was fawned on by all the Nazi leaders and thought this was fine.
The Windsors dined with senior Nazis. Goebbels wrote,
"It's a shame he is no longer king. With him we would have entered into an alliance."
Edward was also invited to Goering's home. The two men played with a toy railway set up for Goering's nephew. An aeroplane flew across the room on a wire, scattering wooden bombs on the trains below.
Even though Edward was no longer king, the Germans saw him as not just an ally, but someone who could be effectual, who had extraordinary relationships, who was still taken seriously in certain quarters.
The highlight of their trip was on the 22nd of October, when they called to see Hitler at his mountain retreat. Hitler's translator recalled that the leader said of Wallis that she would have made a good queen.
The Duke of Windsor always thought that some sort of accommodation would be possible, even when everybody else knew that it was out of the question.
Even as late as March 1939, when the policy of appeasement had been totally discredited, the Duke recorded for radio a statement pleading for peace with Germany. The BBC refused to broadcast it. On the 3rd of September that year, Britain declared war on Germany. The Duke was stationed in France and given the rank of Major General, with the task of liaising between the British and the French.
But it wasn't a real job. It was a job that any number of other people were doing much more effectively.
Churchill distrusted him and made sure he was kept away from any real intelligence. The Duke realised what the Prime Minister was doing and vented his frustration in a stream of letters to Churchill, blaming the King, being merely fresh evidence of my brother's continued efforts to humiliate me. And he mocked British intelligence services by writing on the envelope, "To whomsoever steams this letter open, I hope you are as edified at the contents of this letter as I am over having to write them."
Winston Churchill, of course, is trying to fight the war at this stage. He's got far more important things to worry about. The Battle of Britain is being fought. It's a national crisis. The nation is in peril such as it hadn't been since the days of Napoleon. And the last thing he wanted to do was to have to answer these trivial questions from the Duke of Windsor.
Edward was not discreet about his displeasure. On the 27th of January 1940, the German minister at The Hague, Count von Zech-Berkes-Roeder, wrote,
"The Duke has openly expressed dissatisfaction about his treatment, which has given me the opportunity to establish lines leading directly to him."
With Hitler's armies now on an offensive across Europe, the Duke's tendency towards reckless indiscretion could now have serious consequences. The Germans were poised to invade France, and the Allies predicted the attack to come from one of three possible directions. The lowlands of Belgium, ideal for Hitler's tanks, the heavily defended Maginot Line, or through the densely wooded Ardennes. Hitler planned to attack across the lowlands and dispatched his battle plans by plane, but it crashed in Belgium. The pilot tried to destroy these critical papers, but the Germans didn't know whether they had fallen into Allied hands. Hitler stood down 50 divisions and waited. But not for long, because the Duke of Windsor told the German minister at The Hague that the Allied War Council had been discussing some German invasion plans rescued from a crashed plane. When Hitler heard of this, he quickly changed his attack. Wrong-footing the Allies, he sent his tanks through the lightly defended Ardennes. German armies swarmed into France, and by May 1940 were threatening Paris.
It is remarkable that Hitler and the Germans attacked just in the right place. Hitler and the Germans could not have done it any better. It was absolutely spot-on brilliant. But certainly allegations have been made against the Duke and Duchess of Windsor that they either knowingly or unknowingly helped the Germans in this regard.
Now the Duke would cause Winston Churchill further anxiety. Instead of evacuating with his regiment, he immediately fled, and with Wallace travelled south to Biarritz. His close friend and assistant Major Metcalfe returned to their quarters to find that the Duke had stripped them bare and taken all the cars. He wrote,
"He has run like two rabbits. He deserted his job in 1936. Well, he's deserted his country now. It's the end."
The newly released FBI files also reveal the Duchess's astonishing leaks to the Nazis via von Ribbentrop.
The Duchess was obtaining a variety of information concerning official activities which she was passing on to the Germans.
The files describe how the Windsors moved to a hotel in Biarritz. Within minutes of them checking in, the Duchess had informed von Ribbentrop of their whereabouts. To Churchill's alarm, Berlin radio were proudly able to announce not only where the Windsors were staying, but even their room number. While France was falling and thousands of British soldiers were being evacuated from Dunkirk, Wallace contacted the Gestapo to request that her maid be sent to collect some of their belongings from their Paris residence. Now Italy declared war on France, and to Churchill's consternation, the Duke and Duchess fled south again.
The Windsors had to leave the country, and instead of coming back to Britain, which is what they should have done, they went to fascist Spain. And they fell in with a large number of pretty dodgy people, dodgy businessmen, fascists, really the detritus of society.
The news of the Windsors' arrival in Madrid caused great excitement in Berlin. With France in German hands, Hitler believed that Britain would be next. He thought that Edward could be used to urge the British people to accept German occupation, with him returning as their king. All they had to do was grab him.
There was a German plan to send in paratroopers and kidnap the Duke and Duchess. And Winston Churchill was very keen indeed to get them back to Britain and out of harm's way.
Hitler's plan of using the Duke as a puppet king was not so far-fetched. Overhearing their conversation at table, the American ambassador wrote an alarm to the US Secretary of State.
The Duke of Windsor declared that the most important thing now to be done was to end the war before thousands more were killed or maimed to save the faces of a few politicians.
When Churchill heard of this, he ordered the Duke back to Britain or face a court-martial.
The Duke and Duchess of Windsor show themselves pretty much at their worst in this period, when they are making up any kind of excuses for not coming home.
To get them back to Britain, Churchill sends them to Portugal.
There's this cat and mouse game between both sides as they try to secure the Windsors for their own purposes.
The Duke and Duchess safely crossed the Portuguese border and headed for Estoril. But to Churchill's horror, they fell again into dubious company.
Portugal was neutral at that time, and I think that the concern of Winston was really that Estoril was rather a hotbed of German spies and one thing another.
They were now put up by a wealthy Nazi supporter called Ricardo Silva.
They were fascists. He didn't like that. He felt quite at home with that. The Duke of Windsor rather liked sort of hanging about the swimming pool of this rather right-wing Portuguese banker.
A British official in Lisbon, David Eccles, wrote,
I distrust the Duke of Windsor. I shall watch him at breakfast, lunch and dinner with a critical eye.
This was justified, as on July the 11th, the Duke would come out with his most damning and remarkable comment, which the German ambassador in Lisbon passed to Berlin.
The Duke believes with certainty that continued heavy bombing would make England ready for peace.
Hitler had the idea that the bombing of the United Kingdom would send people into a panic and would induce the British people to turn against the rulers. That there would be an opportunity to bring the Duke of Windsor back as the sovereign.
Churchill had to get them out of the way, and he scoured the globe, hitting upon the Bahamas as a place to send the Windsors into exile. So on the 1st of August 1940, having kept the ship waiting for 6 hours, the Duke and Duchess sailed from Lisbon, bound for the Bahamas. Frank Giles, a young diplomat, was sent to welcome the couple when they broke their journey in Bermuda.
When we arrived at Government House, after these ceremonies were over, he came into my study and said, why did no one curtsy to my wife? Who ordered this? So I simply handed him a copy of the cable that we had received from London, in which these instructions were set forth. And he looked at it, and his face darkened, and he said, this is all the Queen's doing. My brother is all right. The Queen is behind this, and left the room in a rage.
The Duke and Duchess were disowned by the British royal family and shunned by the British government. Now they were sent into exile. But as the newly released FBI files show, even in the inconsequential role as governor of the Bahamas, Edward's outspoken views would threaten to jeopardize Churchill's plans of bringing America in on the Allies' side. Just 1 year into the Second World War, and Britain's former king was seen as such a danger, he'd been sent into exile 4,000 miles away from Britain. The man who had once commanded an empire was now governor of the Bahamas.
If Churchill had rated the Duke of Windsor highly, he would have got something really significant, like Canada or Australia, one of these really important jobs, or Viceroy of India.
Instead, the Duke was in charge of 29 scattered islands, covering an area just half the size of Wales. The Duchess was unimpressed with her new home.
I hate this place more each day. We both hate it. The locals are petty-minded. The visitors common and uninteresting.
Even in this remote location, Churchill was taking no chances with the Duke. He warned, "May I venture a word of serious counsel? It will be necessary for the governor of the Bahamas to express views about the war and the general situation which are not out of harmony with the British government." Edward ignored him in spectacular fashion. In December 1940, he was offered an exclusive interview with American journalist Fulton Oursler, editor of Liberty magazine. Oursler was a friend of President Roosevelt, who, although sympathetic to Churchill, had not yet brought America into the war. When Oursler asked the Duke about the rumors of a revolution in Germany, he replied, "There will be no revolution in Germany. It would be a tragic thing for the world if Hitler were overthrown. Hitler is the right and logical leader of the German people. He is a great man. Tell Mr. Roosevelt that if he will make an offer of intervention for peace, that the Duke of Windsor will instantly issue a statement supporting it. And that will start a revolution in England that will force peace." Churchill was outraged, describing the Duke's words as defeatist and pro-Nazi. The article was heavily censored. 4 months later, when the Duke and Duchess arrived in Miami, Churchill and Roosevelt took no risks. The Windsors were put under 24-hour surveillance. Every dinner they attended, every call they made, every golf course they visited was monitored. The FBI built up a considerable mass of intelligence on the Windsors, their files painting a damning picture of their behavior and the threat they posed.
Clearly, the outlines of this history become evident, that the Duke and Duchess were pro-German, were sympathetic to National Socialism, wanted to negotiate a peace, wanted to come back to and return to the throne in the United Kingdom.
The Duke and Duchess never fulfilled their 5-year term in the Bahamas. They announced their resignation in January 1945. Before leaving, the Duke was overheard as saying, "After the war is over and Hitler has crushed the Americans, we'll take over. The British don't want me as their king, but I'll be back as their leader." The Duke and Duchess, unwelcome in England, settled in France, where they remained in a luxurious house near Paris for the rest of their lives. Frank Giles and his wife dined with them on several occasions and found that the Duke's political outbursts continued to cause alarm.
It must have been the middle 50s. When Eden had become Prime Minister, he said, "Oh, Eden, he really helped to bring the war on." And then there was a short pause, and then he added, "And of course Roosevelt and the Jews." And I thought this was such an outrageous thing to say that I seriously thought of leaving the room.
The royal family never forgave them for what they had done.
It even said that when Edward did go and see his brother George VI at Buckingham Palace, that the Queen Mother would disappear. She didn't want to see him. They all regarded it as a terrible betrayal.
Edward died in 1972. He was buried at Windsor Castle. Wallis lived until the age of 90. When she died in 1986, she was buried next to him. Her headstone read simply, "Wallis, Duchess of Windsor." She was never given a royal title. The romance of the handsome young king who gave up his throne for the love of an unsuitable woman is only one side of the story. Edward VIII was a Nazi sympathiser who compromised Britain's war effort at a time of great national peril. When he abdicated, it was believed that he had averted a constitutional crisis. But had he remained as king, the consequences for Britain could have been truly calamitous.
I think, actually, that Mrs. Simpson saved not only the monarchy, but the country. She's actually my candidate for the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square.